Without further ado, I wanted to kick off our next panel, which is on creating a flourishing maker ecosystem, and just briefly introduce the panel today. So moderating, we have Dorothy Jones-Davis, who is the Executive Director of Nation of Makers. So Nation of Makers is a nonprofit that is really focused on supporting maker organizations through advocacy, through things like fundraising and policy and resource sharing. It builds on a lot of the work that has already happened, and it's about sort of expanding capacity. So welcome, Dorothy. We also have Mark Hatch, who I know very well, and Mark was the former CEO of Tech Shop, is a real thought leader in the maker community, is the author of the Maker Movement Manifesto, and I hear is also writing a new book, and is currently the entrepreneur in residence at the Jacobs Design Institute at Berkeley. We also have joining us today Sonya Pryor-Jones, who is the Chief Implement Officer, but I also like to say the Chief Community Builder at the Fab Foundation. And so Sonya is an educator by background, and she also has done work in community development and entrepreneurship related to the Fab Foundation. And then we have Trey, who is the Executive Director of Maker Ed, Trey Lathe. And so he's been the ED there since 2014 and has really been working on broadening participation of women and underrepresented minorities in computer and technology fields even before that. He also served as the co-chair for the first DC Mini Maker Fair and the Making Education Great Symposium in DC. So I'll hand it off to you, Dorothy.
Am I on? Okay, now I'm on. So today we're talking about how do we create a flourishing maker ecosystem. And really, I mean, how many people in the audience are from what would be considered maker organizations or makers or... I was going to say, don't make me call you out. Okay. Yes, many of you are familiar faces in the audience, and so what you probably already realize is that we're part of a larger ecosystem. You know, what we do is very important. Each of the different roles that we play is part of sort of a larger grouping of things that bring us together, that help us to move forward as a society, as a community, both locally and what we're doing at our local level, but also as we look more globally, so within the United States, nationally, and then internationally as we look towards other countries that we work with, either in our actual work or countries that, you know, rely upon us to come up with some of the solutions and co-create with them on their endeavors. And so this whole panel today is really to discuss how do we create a maker ecosystem that is flourishing, that is alive. And before I go on, I wanted to actually ask the panelists to sort of describe what you think a flourishing maker ecosystem would look like. Like, what would the ideal maker ecosystem be? And are we on our way there? Are we there yet? Are we not there yet? I'd just love to hear some of your thoughts about that. Don't all jump. I actually didn't tell them I was going to ask them this until like 5 seconds ago, so.
So I feel like everybody looked at me for some reason. So I'll attempt to answer this. I think, you know, first the question is really about what we mean when we say ecosystem. So being a person who's worked in education for a little while now, you know, we get excited about terms and buzzwords and sort of our internal jargon. And so when we think about ecosystems, at least from my perspective, it really is going back to that frame of reference in the original paradigm, which is looking at ecology and systems thinking and theory to really allow us to, you know, start with a very thoughtful framework that's extremely inclusive, right? But that also figures out a way to honor each element within that system based on whatever unique assets they may bring. And that's like really hard, right? You know, and then also feeling comfortable that you're not going to necessarily tame all of those things, but you're going to be thoughtful in the work that you do, you know, knowing that you're not the only one doing that work, right? And there's something else or somewhere else up above you, down beneath you, next to you that is doing something similar, and there are some opportunities for synergy. And so when I think about this work in terms of making and digital fabrication, it really is also recognizing that we're not on an island alone, and there's some other good work that is out there that we want to connect to make the larger, you know, system better.
Is this on? Okay. Yeah, actually, it's interesting. Something you said reminded me. I'm a biologist by training, evolutionary biologist, et cetera. So when we say ecosystem, I think, the redwood forest or something outside there. But it's a good reason we use that word, because in an ecosystem, everything is interconnected. There's nothing alone that stands alone, and not just interconnected, but rely on each other. So however it works, they're interconnected. So for me, the ideal ecosystem is one that's actually, I think, is building. I mean, I see it every time I come to a conference or I work with somebody in our programs, is that the connections are quite diverse. And I was just, talking to somebody today, and they lived in LA, actually, and I was thinking, we do work there, and I had to go look it up. But I know somebody who works there who then also works with somebody in Pittsburgh who, it is really well connected. I think some of the more ideal thing is if I could go, and I think Dorothy and Asian Makers actually talked about this in the past, but if I could go and say, how is this person connected, or person, or organization, or institution, or program connected to all these others? If I could just say, push a button and then have all those connections. And we did that at our convening a year ago, where we had a map and we had everybody put where they are and then connect with everybody who, where they are. We did that at the summit also, right? But I want a permanent thing like that, to see where all, because those connections are there, absolutely. But I would love to be able to see them so we can make more and deeper.
So I think Pittsburgh has probably done the best job that I'm aware of. So I'm not going to go into details. I don't know all of them, but they've done a remarkable job. So I look at it at a bunch of C's. So we need to convene, because you have to get the makers together, because they don't see one another very often, because they have jobs and families and other things. And so convening is important, which is why I think makerspaces and maker fairs, mini maker fairs, are so important. But also we need to convene thought leaders and policy folks and educators to interact directly with the maker community. I think that's what Pittsburgh was showing. And then we need to create sponsors, and these are education systems. These are corporations that are starting to become more involved, and there are actual solid economic reasons why they should do that. And there's a coordination piece, which again Pittsburgh I think has done a remarkable job. And then there's the cash, because this stuff it takes money. But there are buckets of it in different places, and so we need to coordinate how we're going after that cash. There's education cash, there's corporate cash, there's foundation cash, there's money to be made from selling things and so forth. So I convene, create, coordinate, and cash. That helps to create that ecosystem, and I think Pittsburgh is probably at the moment the best. I think we still have a long way to go, but they've done a really remarkable job in the last couple of years.
Awesome. So I think you guys brought up a lot of different things. This idea of layering, right? So there's all these different layers of folks, just like in an actual ecosystem where you have sort of different layers of different types of, critters, living. So I'm also a biologist, but sort of living animals and organisms and how they interact with one another. And so I think one thing that many of you I know have worked on, actually I think all of you have worked on in some way or another, is actually this idea of inclusion. So how do we make sure that everybody is actually at the table? So I think one thing when you're building an ecosystem, we all know that everyone should be there. When you ask who's a part of the maker ecosystem, it would be everybody that considers themselves a maker or is interfacing in some way with the maker movement. But we know from repeated sort of convenings that no matter how hard we try, and we all try very, very hard, we always end up sort of missing some folks. And actually just came from, there was just a wonderful panel that was next door where Blaise Starkey was there from the Lakota tribe and from Standing Rock. And it's amazing, he was saying he just felt like the resources that he's seen over this past week that other people take for granted, that his people have not yet seen. And some things that are so very basic, they're missing from that conversation. And, and it's something many of us have noticed, right? So he's not the only one who's noticed that. And coming here, we've noticed a lack of sort of inclusion and diversity. And again, it's not because folks are not trying, it's just because somehow we're not able to get to everybody. So I guess the question I ask is, what work are you guys doing to create a more inclusive maker ecosystem? And I know some of you are doing some very intentional work in that area. And how can we do better to make sure that more people are at the table so that our ecosystem is in fact a fully intact, true ecosystem that represents everyone? So Trey, do you want to go first? Oh, yeah, you look so pensive over there.
I was thinking deeply, actually, about that. So we do some things that are very intentional. We have a Vista AmeriCorps program we call Maker Vista that works in high poverty schools. And we're actually working really hard right now to find ways to be very inclusive in all our programs and all our work we do. And down to the really minimal thing of, like at our convening, which is we had our third one this year, our third annual one. This year, we asked, so part of the problem of having the same people at these convenings is that, part of the problem is I see the same people often, right? Which is great, they're all wonderful people, and I love you all. But, what's that? But not everybody's included. So one of the things they did, it's a minor thing, one of the things we did at the convening is we asked people, and then we asked them to ask two others that they often don't come. So at the convening, there was lots of people that I had never seen before, ever. And several of them had said, oh, I work at X, and we never considered ourselves makers, but wow, this is what we are. And so they were included, and they were part of it, and they felt it. It's a minor thing, and it's one thing I'm working at NSF and before. Inclusion has to be deeply intentional. It can't be something you just say, oh yeah, we're just going to make it free. We can make the convening free for everybody, for example, or our programs, or et cetera, but that doesn't mean everybody's included. So that was one little intentional piece we did at the convening.
So I'll come to this question in a couple of different ways that might sound contradictory initially, but bear with me. And so I think there is, and I'm speaking about diversity specifically as it relates to gender and race. I think that's important, to have that perspective. And so I think there are a couple of layers here. I think first of all, the notion of convening is very important, but one mistake that we make is if we assume people aren't in the room with us, they're not convening on their own. Mm-hmm. And so I think that's something for us to be very conscious about, and it's about having more people integrate in whatever convening camp you may be in, but also finding out where they're convening and going to be a part of that as well. I think, just in terms of gender and racial diversity as well, there are a lot of people who are in chairs of leadership and chairs of influence, and so if you see those that you're aiming to serve not in those rooms where you are making those decisions, then I think you want to think strategically about how to get them there, right? And so you might get invited to speak at event X, but if you know someone through your eco-map, right, that is just as thoughtful and doing a lot of great work, maybe it's time for you to suggest that they go be the speaker, right? Or if you're in a situation where there's a funding opportunity, and this is a big one, right? And you're not quite, in the best position at that given time to meet the needs or the goals of that funding, who else in your network that you might send that opportunity to? So I think the real, sort of opportunities around inclusion and diversity are hard, right? Because it usually requires us to give something up. The other thing is hiring practices, right? A lot of us are engaging with labs and spaces all over the country or all over the world where there are real job opportunities. So what kinds of things might you be doing to generate the kind of diverse pipeline so when that next, Fab Lab manager position or program manager position becomes available, that you could tap women and people of color to take advantage of those opportunities. And those are some of the things that, we're doing right now in our work.
Awesome. One other piece I'll add to that too is outside of looking at gender and race and ethnicity, thinking about the breadth of the type of making. So this is something that Nation of Makers has kind of taken on as something that we're looking towards doing in the future, is highlighting. So as the Week of Making, and I'm going to make a cheap plug here, Week of Making, June 16th to the 22nd, one of the things that we're doing in our promotions, as we're starting to promote more for the Week of Making, is celebrating a diversity of types of making. So, and talking again to Blaze, one thing, and I've been aware of this, as I also have some Native background in my culture, that Native culture is rich with making, yet I don't see that represented necessarily at a maker fair or at on some of the things that I see in terms of videos and things that we've made about making. So even acknowledging that other cultures, other experiences are part of the maker movement, thinking about food making. So we have some exciting stuff planned for the Week of Making. I won't reveal too much except to say someone famous is going to come and give little videos. So you can think about who that might be. But we have a number of things planned to highlight this diversity. But I want to shift gears a little bit because we're running out of time according to Stephanie. I really...
have time for Q&A though.
Okay, I know. So I really want to sort of shift gears because a lot of the maker ecosystem is also around, sort of creating an ecosystem that can function on a financial level. So, thinking about sort of economic development, thinking about workforce development, thinking about how we can build a stronger community. And so I guess this question is probably best directed towards Mark, but what are some of the economic drivers that might attract corporate and economic development funding for the creation of innovation-focused makerspaces? And a second question that's also somewhat related is, how might workforce initiatives coordinate with, the education and making spheres to improve upon the development of local talent?
Yeah. So one of the reasons I'm doing some work at UC Berkeley is I'm trying to help, and I understand there's some of this out there, but if you guys have it, please send it my way. We need more quantitative data to show the outcomes, both on the education side and on the economic development side. The funding is already out there. Like, we have lots of funding going through educational systems, and we need to redirect some of it, still have the same and better outcomes as a result, but there's a pot of money there. We have money in HUD. When we were trying to build the LA location, we had $1.5 million lined up from some creative ways of managing and creating new jobs there. And from the corporate perspective, there are a bunch of reasons why corporations should be investing in these. I'll give you a quick couple examples. Ford was able to more than double the number of patents that were being issued from their employee base in 4.5 years, and became the #1 intellectual property producer in the automotive industry by putting in an open access makerspace for the entire community. It fully funded it, and they got way more back as a result. Recently, in our experience with Samsung in Texas, they bought 300 memberships, and they were, within about 8 weeks, they had created $1.7 million in annualized savings because of a program that they deployed. So that meant over the next 10 years, they're going to save $17 million. That's more than enough to keep a lot of fab labs and makerspaces open. And then the job creation, our estimate for, and I need somebody to third-party audit this, but our estimate is that the 3 locations of the tech shops in the Bay Area, which really are about economics, have created $6 billion in incremental shareholder value, 2,000 jobs, $200 million in annual salaries. The state of California is making more money on the income taxes from the jobs that were created in these 3 locations than it cost us to open them annually. When those shares pass over, our estimate is that the state of California is going to pick up between $800 million to $1.4 billion from 3 makerspaces in the Bay Area. Now maybe ours is unique, but Brooklyn has had a similar experience. They've created like $1.9 billion in activity. If we can continue to capture these, then we can go to the economic development departments and say, this is a more efficient way of spending the money that you've got. We can go to our educators and say, this is a great way of spending money to get kids. And this then helps with access as well, because we've got multiple funding sources. And I believe the data is available. We just need to go get it and then present it to the folks that it matters.
So actually you got to the next question that I was thinking of asking the group, which is, how do we best measure impact? Because it occurred to me that, it's one thing to say that we're creating a flourishing maker ecosystem, but how do you measure that? What's the definition of flourishing? And this is something that, when I was looking at the title of our panel, it's like, okay, well, how would I define success? And this is so important to all of us, as you said. I mean, there's obviously economic metrics that we can use that would be very, very helpful in terms of funding and long-term sustainability, but it's also really important as we, reach back to the community, as we look at other partnerships with other organizations, just being able to communicate what the impact of this is. Of course, it's deeply important for education as we're trying to convince sometimes stubborn superintendents and leaders within educational systems to operate and operationalize some of the things that we know are great best practices, having that data. So what are some of the impact metrics that you think either we have, I'm going to ask it sort of twofold. What things do we have that we can use to measure? And you've identified some in sort of economic terms, but where should we go? What kinds of things should we start to think about measuring as a community?
So,
don't all rush.
Okay, I think I'm going to start with the latter question. I think in terms of what things we should measure really speaks specifically to why people have a space in the first place, right? And so I think, while we're thinking about the ecosystem, we do also have to sort of center back down to the specifics. If you're community X and you decide that you want a makerspace or a fab lab, there's a reason for that, right? And so whatever those core values and reasons are, those are the things that I think we want to start with and measure first. Because there's impact measures for chasing money, and there's impact measures for sort of the local purpose and change that people want to see, right? And so it's my opinion that the ones that matter the most and are most sustaining matter to those communities and why they decided on these spaces. I think in terms of some of what we know or what we're learning, has a lot to do with, some of the easier measures, in terms of how many people are showing up through the door, what kind of skill sets are they acquiring. I think some of the more interesting measures that we're starting to study are, particularly in schools, what does it look like, 10 years from now when that young lady, Andrea Fields, was 14 years old and had her experience in the first Fab Lab, and now she's a civics engineer student and going around the country teaching teachers how to use these spaces, right? So those kinds of things are the things that we're starting to figure out. How do we do a better job of documenting, to your point, and getting those stories out and getting them out as a portfolio instead of sort of these one-off stories. And there's so much behind stories like that that it's sort of hard to put that in a bucket and a number that you can count, but figuring out more creative ways to do that is important.
It seems pretty daunting. I mean, we need definitely quantitative data. We obviously need qualitative data, but each qualitative piece of information, each story has so much behind it and the complication of that.
I think we have the qualitative data. It's so obvious in the kids' eyes and the results. And when a 14-year-old girl, Austin, learned how to weld, and she went up to Beth Comstock, who had funded it from GE, and said, I'm going to become an engineer because I had this experience. But yet we know that 14 is often too late. I mean, we need to be reaching these young ladies and minorities at 8, 9, and 10 years old, showing them people like themselves doing this in trailers all over the place. We need this longitudinal study where we can say, okay, this is what we did in this community over 4 years, and this was the outcome. And qualitatively, we know this is working. But if we're going to go get the $10 billion, I think that this country needs to put labs in every elementary school, junior high, and high school, and integrate the classroom. That's what we're going to need to be able to do it. I know I may be wrong, because things are happening qualitatively. It is so powerful. I may be wrong, but it would certainly be nice to know that we are, in fact, on the right track.
Right, and I wouldn't disagree with that. I don't know that I think we need labs in every classroom across the country, but I do think we need to do a better job at programming what we already have. In my mind's eye, at some point the market is oversaturated, right, with certain things, just period. And so what is it that's, sort of the essence and the kernel of what people are getting in those spaces, and how can we iterate that, right? Because in my mind's eye, the same Fab Lab that we have of today looks very different 5 or 10 years from now because it's based on need. I think another important piece to all of this is talking about process, and also measuring, process measures are just as important in terms of how do we operate as an ecosystem to, move the needle on these types of issues.
Okay, did you want to chime in?
No, I'm just going to ditto Sonya.
You're going to say ditto? Okay, awesome. Yeah, so I have one last question before we turn over to our lovely audience. And I guess if you had to define what the barrier is to creating a flourishing maker ecosystem, what would it be? The single, not a complex set, because there's probably a lot of things you could name, but if there was one, who is our arch nemesis here in creating this maker ecosystem, and is it something that we think we can tackle? I'm going to stump you guys, and then you're going to be like,
Well, I'm going to take it from kind of an easy perspective. It's awareness right now. I think we have about 4% awareness. Like, I think it's up from maybe 2% last year. I mean, outside of the Bay Area, when I'm on a plane and I say, I wrote a book about the maker movement, I get blank stares everywhere I go. They have no idea what it is I'm talking about. And we're not going to get any funding and if we can't get the awareness up.
I agree.
I completely agree with you, and I think that, talking about it from an ecosystem perspective, we're really sort of talking about the structural stability pieces, and I think awareness for advocacy and the resources, whether financial or people, is really critical. I'll tell a quick story, not this last NSBE convention, but the one before that. And so National Society of Black Engineers, they have a wonderful K through 12 program, right? These kids are engaged in all sorts of things. I spoke to a group of about 70 people at this conference, and only about 4 or 5 of them knew what I was talking about when I said Fab Lab or Makerspace. Now, I get it with Fab Lab because it's a very specific brand, but Makerspace, with all the work that you guys have been doing, and Dale and others, you think everybody would know, but there's a really low awareness level about what these spaces even are beyond what else they might be capable of doing for people.
Yeah, I would, again, ditto that. I just ditto you. Awareness is a huge one. Again, it's the same thing when I'm on a plane or talking to people, ask what I do. I say Executive Maker Education Initiative. I get the blank stare. If I phrase it a little differently and I talk about hands-on, student-driven, engaged learning, they're all on board no matter who it is I talk to, parent, teacher, stranger, corporate. And then I tell them it's the maker movement, and then they start to say, oh, I see what you mean. So it is about awareness. I have to say, though, in the 5 years I've been aware of the maker movement, when I think it was you, Dorothy, who first told me about the maker movement and maker education. I was like, oh, that's what I do? I mean, oh, yeah, that's me. In those 5 years, I've seen a lot of change. And things like, my husband just sent me an article about 5 maker hotels around the world to go to. I was like, a maker hotel? I was like, what is that?
You still need to send me that article.
I know. I was like, what is that exactly? 1 or 2 of them seem like one of them has a makerspace in it. The people who are there.
That's where our next Maker Ed convening is, right?
Exactly, I know. But they're in places like Tahiti, and we have to go there.
That's fine.
But so some of that is starting. I mean, we see actors in videos, and we see some of that. We talked in the previous panel of we should tweet out to Beyonce and tell her to say it. But yeah, I think that's the biggest hurdle. That and the mundane money thing. I mean, it's that it frustrates me as the ED of a nonprofit that where the constant need for funding, but not just that, is I meet so many amazing people with amazing ideas that if I could just work with them on something, except for the lack of funding, right? And so, I mean, just in the last 2 days, I think I've talked to 3 or 4 people like, oh, that'd be great. Now I have to go look for it. I mean, that's, part of life, but awareness might bring that.
Yeah, I think awareness will. I mean, I think there are pockets of funding that probably we don't currently have access to as a community because we just haven't. So recently I shared with a number of people, I've been contacted by several tourism boards, which was not an area that I had considered. And it turns out there are state tourism grants, and they have very different metrics, things like how many hotels rooms will you use in your time for your event, things that are different than what we think of, but they're interested, and getting new folks interested in understanding what we do and why it's important to their entire, like our gigantic, ecosystem. So, take out the word maker and just say creating a flourishing community or flourishing ecosystem in general, having people realize we are part of that solution, right? So, well, without further ado, I'd love to hear what you guys have questions about. I think we have to wait for microphones to come around, but introduce yourself and tell us your question.
I'm Leah Haynes. I'm Executive Director of the Two-Bit Circus Foundation. You're welcome for tonight. And I wanted to punctuate, I love what you said, that we should have a makerspace in every elementary, middle, and high school. And I'm curious about why you thought not necessary. Like, what group would you say we can leave out?
So my point is not about leaving anyone out, but my point is about let's make sure the spaces that we have are maximized in quality and reach before we go put a new one on the next corner. And so the example I always like to use is back when I was in school, computers were all the rave, right? And so everybody wanted a computer lab. But if you spend the resources to put a computer lab in a school community where there is no one with the human capacity to really utilize that, for students and for the teaching staff, that computer lab will sit there, it will be dusty, and funders will be very upset that their dollars were wasted. And so the thing that I'm sort of challenging us to think about is before we go raise up another space, let's be very thoughtful about the spaces that exist and get them to maximize capacity before we just, oversaturate the market with spaces.
So I think some of that's fair, because one of the things that frustrates me is seeing somebody who thinks that a makerspace is about 3D printers, and they buy a few and then they die, and now you've killed the makerspace, and you've probably killed funding off of the thing that you could have done next year if we had the processes in place and so forth. But I'm a big Seymour Papert guy, and it's clear to me that project-based education in every classroom can change lives, and we haven't done it in the past for a wide range of reasons. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't do it in the future. But dropping a bunch of equipment in the space when nobody's prepared for it would be the death knell to this entire movement. I totally agree with that.
Yeah, so actually, I'm going to go off that because our philosophy at Maker Ed, and mine, is that we don't need schools shouldn't have a makerspace. They should be a makerspace. So I would love to. I mean, there are
yes, right.
The whole school should be a makerspace.
Yeah.
It doesn't need to have like this place where you drop a bunch of materials and teachers have to go to do it. It would be great if the entire school was makerspace. So that's what I'd like to see. Every school a makerspace. I mean,
Yeah,
whatever form that takes.
You see it, and I mean, the example, and I think it was given at the Maker Ed convening that someone made a great example, is that, we wanted to have computer labs, and so we had computer labs to have computers, but now many schools are dismantling their computer labs, and instead they're looking to build makerspaces because they think that's the next thing to do. But the reality is they got rid of the computer labs not because they don't value computers, but now computers are everywhere. The computer is in my pocket. The students come with a computer with them every day. So, they've changed and reframed the way that they thought about computers. And so similarly, we'll hopefully be having this conversation in 5 years or less that's saying, okay, we have makerspaces everywhere, what's the next big thing? And we're thinking about that. But, I think we do need to think more thoughtfully, as Sonya said, about, what existing infrastructure we have, what supports can we make sure that are there, and how we can build systems that are equipped to sustain the actual maker mindset and all of the skills that we're trying to build. And it's not always tools, right? Sometimes it's actually, or most of the time, it's the mindset that comes first, and then the tools are just a means to an end.
Right, and I think just to underscore what Trey was saying, it really is about philosophy and approach, and how do you spread that, and you really do that through a quality program. That's the stuff that you can scale in most spaces and places around the world.
We have another question over here.
Hi, I'm Randy Lynn of Kids Code Mississippi, And I have a question for Dorothy. You mentioned the Week of Making. Could you tell us a little bit more about that and how to get involved?
Yes, and I'll slip you a few dollars later for bringing that up. So the National Week of Making is carrying on. So Nation of Makers came out of the White House Obama administration, and so for the past 3 years, we had a National Week of Making that was more of a proclamation. It's a time of year that we all celebrate the maker movement. And we're continuing on the tradition of having a National Week of Making, and the ways that we're asking people to participate are a number of different things. One, you can host an event at your organization. You can invite people very simply. You can even have your existing program and label it Week of Making. We're happy to have you celebrate. If you go to our website, nationofmakers.us, or if you go to weekofmaking.org, you can get to a listing of events in your area. If you're unable to have an event yourself, we encourage you to go and support a makerspace in your community. And then another way that we have, we're asking for folks' support is actually a community build. So today, a little bit later today, we'll be releasing a video about a community build idea, which is a challenge to everyone to find a problem within their community. We're actually hoping that people will work together versus alone, but we're fine with either, to solve a problem within their community and then post about it. So use any form of social media, tag it Week of Making so we can find you, and then we want to uplift and celebrate those solutions to our community challenges during that Week of Making. We also encourage you to uplift folks in your community. So if there are folks within your region that are doing really amazing things that are makers, we want you to tell us about them. So if you go to the Week of Making page, you can see a place to put profiles, to also send us pictures and photos of your spaces and organizations. Really, it's a big party we're having across the country where we can celebrate all of you and all of the people that you serve, all of the things that you're doing. And we want to show a breadth of making, so we want coders to identify as makers. It's not a bean counting exercise, it's more about the maker mindset and the idea that yes, you can change things through what you make and create in this world.
I'll be a total plant here, but mostly for Trey and Sonya. Thinking about what we were talking about, mindsets over tools, but with so many schools, I think that one place where we do have a lot of awareness is in schools, but a lot of them hear makerspace, and they go, it's space. How do we help build that message, and what resources are available to help educators do that?
Well,
Yeah,
another
let
plug.
me tell you. Let Sonya start.
So, Maker Ed has been at this longer than we have in a concerted effort. So there's a lot that we're learning from their team. But we are in the middle of a new initiative called Scopes. And that guy who posed the question actually has some informational pieces for you. Imagine that. But it's a very specific part of the ecosystem, right? K-12 educators operate in a world very differently from the rest of us, right? They've got a lot on them, and I'll try to speed this up. And so our goal in that effort is to really begin to take a closer look from their perspective of what their needs are, and then to take our platform, which are digital fabrication spaces, a very specific part of this making continuum, and see how we could take those in their school environments and help them sort of address the challenges that they're facing in terms of deeper student learning and engagement, in terms of dealing with the standards, because they're there, they're not going away, and really using a different way of thinking for teachers and students to take advantage of that, and to let them be the leadership and guide us, while just bringing to the forefront some of the things that we've learned along the way from people like Seymour and others, in terms of how you engage students and teachers in learning collectively and as a community.
Yeah, so thank you. So we have a lot of ways to engage. The first one I will mention, obviously, is because we partner with Digital Promise on the Maker Promise, and that has what? Is it almost 1,600 schools now?
Yeah, the rate of checks we relaunched the website.
Oh yeah, okay, great. Oh, fine. Yeah, so we have a Maker Promise where schools can make certain promises to have a maker champion, some type of space, et cetera. And they make a promise, and we, Digital Promise and Maker Ed, offer them a plethora of resources to help them do that. We also, and and that's in partnership with the Moore Foundation. They've generously funded us to do that. So check that out, because they're doing great stuff. We are doing great stuff with Digital Promise. I was saying they because the team. We also have a program we call Making Spaces. I always pause on that because it used to be called Launch Making. It used to be called by me when we were starting it, Launch Making, so I would still call it that, but it's Making Spaces. It's a program that actually started at Pittsburgh. I'm speaking of Pittsburgh, at the Children's Museum in Pittsburgh, and it's a hub and spoke model. So a hub is a space like a museum or a library or a school district, and then they help schools over a 2-year period build out their maker program. So that might look like building out a makerspace, but it also means making out, professional development and a whole other things. So we partnered with the Children's Museum in Pittsburgh to make that national. So now we have 10 hubs, and each hub has 5 to 10 schools. And this coming September, we'll have our second cohort. So they're kind of overlapping cohorts, and that builds a connection of schools. A lot of them are Maker Promise schools, not all of them. So we'll try to get them in Maker Promise. But we also have other programs. But that's the couple ways for schools. We also have a Vista program that puts Maker Vistas into schools, community schools specifically, to help build out their Maker education program. So those 3 things together, if you're at a school, is like great. So we'd love to have you come on board.
Okay, I think we're coming. We have 3 minutes. Are there any last questions for our group?
I'll do just one more. I would really love to start seeing more experimentation around true open access. We've got universities that are building these spaces all over the U.S. We're spending hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars, and the only people that get to use them are the students on campus. If it's a well-run space, often it's just the department. We need to do the same things in the high schools and the junior highs. If you want to do on-ramps, you need to have it open access so the entire community can come in, because that's when you get the real diversity. You get the artists, and you get the engineers, and you get the kids, and you get the older students, and that's the real community. And I'm a little concerned at the moment that as we go after these pockets of money, because we've been operating in our silos for so long, we just say, well, we'll just do this for our silo. And I would really love to see us just at least begin experimenting. I don't know how it's going to work, but it's a tragedy to have a well-stocked high school with a beautiful lab, and you turn the lights off at 6 o'clock at night.
Yeah, and that's a part of our charter in the Fab Lab network. It's not just about the tools, but how do you allow for public open access? I think the other, trick in that is what relationships already pre-exist with that institution and community that makes them feel welcome to be able to be a part of that, and us sort of going outside of our thinking silos for that as well.
Yeah, and I think there have been so in the work of Nation of Makers, I mean, one of the things we're trying to do are connect these different silos so that they talk with one another, so that we're not reduplicating the same thing and not doing it more efficiently, because I think, like you said, you have this wonderful space. If we all shared it, and if you had a model where, there's almost like a second shift that comes in after school, I mean, that's much more efficient than buying, up another space and putting another space down the street that only another subset of people. So, really talking about how we can cross those silos and connect them together is something that we really are working on. And I do think that that's going to be key to creating an ecosystem that is sustainable, that doesn't run out of money, doesn't run out of resources. I know you have a question, Deanna.
Yeah,
I think. No. Okay, go ahead, real quick.
Just wanted to follow up on that, the idea of open access, because these labs, these makerspaces or Fab Labs go out. Do you think the obstacle of open access is the facility itself being protective of the equipment or limited resources, or do you think the obstacle is getting the people to the space? And have you found it goes both ways? And what do you think is the best way to tackle that?
I think it's a little bit of all of those things. A lot of times you have an institution that's decided on something like this, but it's not already inherent and a part of their culture to be open and collaborative. If you look, many of our cultural and academic institutions around the country are right in the middle of poor urban communities. And those communities don't have any kind of relationship with those organizations and would never feel welcome. I don't care what you were giving away to walk onto that campus or into that facility. So I think there are lots of sort of deep-rooted things that have to be addressed before we think just because we popped up this shiny space, people are gonna come. I think in some cases it's also financial. You know, you have a manager or limited human capital who can only be in that space for so many hours a day, so many days a week, and people not being creative of thinking about, okay, how do we also schedule this person or schedule this resource in a way that we could bring others in? And then safety has also come up, you know, people being very concerned about the liabilities of it all. You know, that if you have community member X that just shows up and they're in your lab and they get hurt, what happens? I think
it's a red herring, by the way. It's a red herring. It's not true. People don't like getting hurt. So as long as you've got, you can deal with it.
We'll tell the lawyers that.
Exactly.
I'm like, I hear you, but I work with lawyers.
Insurance, it's a lot of
insurance is cheap.
Yeah,
it's cheap because people aren't getting hurt very often.
But it's a mentality.
Yeah, it's a mentality.
Well, the question is, who's running the ship? Are the lawyers running our educational institutions, or are lawyers? No, seriously.
So you want to have a much longer panel.
Yeah.
You want to have a much longer discussion.
Yeah, in many places they are running it, so we have to convince them.
But
there are ways around it. We've seen some really creative labs get smart about building their capacity fast with volunteers, and also dealing with safety in terms of how they train people, and you're required to do certain things before you can work on equipment on your own, for example.
And also, I think technology, is another place. I just was talking to folks over at Google who are working on technologies around how do we create systems so that, like, the power's cut off unless you have the appropriate access, unless you're the right person that's supposed to be using the equipment. There are some really new, innovative things that we can do to also make spaces more safe so that that issue goes away. So I think it is something we'll have to learn.
We had 40,000 members, 10 years of operation, 13 locations around the world. As far as we can tell, we had about what would be the equivalent of 3 reportable OSHA injuries of our members.
That's awesome.
And like the biggest one was somebody lost like a half a finger. 40,000 people through these locations are open, 12, 14 hours a day. So insurance was cheap, but we have to have the safety. I mean, it will be an issue. If you're not doing the safety right, it will reach out and bite you.
Okay, well, I think we unfortunately have to wrap up now. I think lunch is coming up because my stomach is growling. But thank you, everybody, on our panel, and thanks to all of you, our wonderful audience, for joining us today. And thanks, Stephanie, and all the folks at Infosys.
Let's give the panelists a round of applause.